What's up, everybody? Nick and Blake back here again for another strategy series video. This time, we're going to be talking about sideboarding, something that we both believe very heavily in being an integral part of Flesh and Blood and something that can make a huge, huge difference in your game plan. Nick and I are fanatical about finding the numbers and doing the math and talking about every card. Some people do that building a deck, and then that's kind of where they stop. Then there's people like us who do it down to the every card has to matter in the sideboarding plan. And I know that's something you're absolutely fanatical about, Nick. You're like me, you have long handwritten notes for every time you play a deck, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of old school in that way. I like to handwrite everything out, but yeah, whenever for all the pro quests, I'll have my little handwritten thing, and I am somebody that swears by preparation. Because the more you do ahead of time, the less you have to think about and waffle with on the day. I am a firm believer in having sideboard plans. So then when you sit down against your matchup, you're playing Lexi. This is what I got. Put it in and execute. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That being said, you can still riff upon your sideboard plans, but we'll kind of get into when that might be appropriate and how you can tech in some sideboard sneakiness as well.
Yeah, 100%. I know the first point that we want to talk about in this video is the idea of finding your core. We talked about this being something that's important to us because of the way that we function when it comes to sideboard. I think there are three schools of thought, right? There's the core card group of people who are people like us. There are the people who come with their complete 80 and then subtract, and there are the people who have their core 60 deck that they swap cards on. We prefer the find your core method, which my number is typically 42 to 48 cards is ideal for your core, the core of your deck. Those are the cards that are not going to change in any matchup, and then you can build your sideboard as what equipment and what cards go in each matchup. I think that allows you to basically have 42 to 48. That's like your consistent base. You know that those numbers never change and they don't mess with your ratios, because that's the problem, right? Like when you start to do the subtraction thing or the swap thing, sometimes when you start to like riff on it, right? Like you said, you can have issues where you accidentally mess with your ratios when you're like sitting in a tournament going, I know this player, I need to add a couple extra cards, this, that, or another thing, right?
Right. No, absolutely. Whenever you're making any sideboard decision, you have to consider how those sideboard changes might actually impact the overall construction of your deck, and make sure that you're still able to pay for what you're putting in there. If you're bringing in those unmovables, make sure you have the blues to pay for it. If you're bringing in that null rune barrier to try to block some arcane, make sure you have the blues to pay for that as well. Who cares if you got the null rune? If you have a handful of reds, you're not going to be pitching to anything.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's something that it's way more relevant in certain matchups than others, for sure. Like I think we acknowledge that, we understand that, but that's part of the construction of your deck, and that's part of your plan that you need to have going into building your sideboard out. If you're going to play into Lexi and you expect it to be ice, and they're going to have Heart of Ice, and they know you're a defensive heavy deck, they're gonna put in Heart of Ice. They're probably gonna activate it every turn. You have to understand that your sideboard plan for that matchup needs to include a higher resource base, because if you're gonna play Unmovable, if you're gonna play Fates and Sinks, now your turns, it's gonna cost you 2 turns to defend with those cards, or 2 cards to defend with 1 card, right? Like Fate Foreseen is no longer a 0 for 4, it's a 1 for 4, and you have to keep that in mind when you're constructing that plan. Or with Rhinar, you have to understand that your core, anything you change on your core has to take into account the potential of Intimidate. Anything you're going to play into, your Rune Blades, you have to understand that anything you change to that is going to affect your ability to block their arcane or block their physical, to trade damage with them. And that's why we're so committed to the finding your core, because every deck should have, 42 to 48 cards that are just good in every match. They're universally the best cards in the deck, and they're the cards that you need for your deck to function.
And while there are a lot of cards too that may not be in that 42 to 48 core, and you play them in 80% of your matchups, 85% of the matchups, the reason we just don't include them in the core in our minds and in our deck building process, our sideboarding process, is just to leave exploration open. I remember for the longest time when we were playing against Prism with Old Bravo, it took us quite a while to kind of realize that Crippling Crush isn't that great in this matchup. If you try to Crippling Crush her and then she just drops her whole hand and tries to stabilize afterwards, when you find different ways to build against a deck, it can really give you some different types of edges and some matchup knowledge and experience edge as well.
Yeah, and some metas determine that certain cards are good in 80 to 90%, but right. A prime example is like we exist in a meta where Unmovable has a lot of utility because there are a lot of decks going big, a lot of decks that have aggressive attacks, but almost universally playing an Unmovable into Rhinar is asking for trouble because you don't determine the resource cost of your hand simply by looking at it. They determine the resource cost of your hand by how much they intimidate and what gets to leave. So like we've talked about that with things like Staunch Response versus Fates and Sinks. Into Rhinar, into a lot of matchups as Guardian players, we love Staunch, and we would love it into Rhinar when they give us those big attacks. The problem is there's no guarantee they're going to leave you with a card to pay for it. And there's potential that they could intimidate away your ability to play any of your cards if you don't have the resources to pay for them. And that's part of why, again, to Nick's point, like Staunch Response is in tons of matchups, but we look at a matchup by matchup basis and go, it's good in 90%, but in that 10% that it's not good in, it's like detrimental. Like it can actually cause us to lose games because it can affect us so negatively.
Right. And I think another pro of having the find your core method, being in that 48 and then adding cards in from your sideboard to work up to that 60, is it really lets you find those extra efficiencies you can get within that deck. The room for a one of, the room for a two of, and where you can kind of slide in some cards that people might not be expecting, or cards that are just really powerful as a one of. Blizzard, for example, is sometimes you want 3 if you're really going heavy on the elements, but when you're not, it can be a lot more powerful as a one of to stop that powerful turn when it's that window, and then just be used to go away when it isn't that window and move on with your day. Exposed to the elements, very much a card in that same vein. Has windows where it's extremely powerful, but has windows where it does nothing. So having that ability to find spots where you can bring these powerful and versatile cards in can really get you over the edge, especially when we're talking about these ProQuest events where you're playing a lot of the people you already know. You're playing in a very known meta, and sometimes you gotta surprise people and catch them by, from left field.
Yeah, I think that goes to finding your core, because I think once you find your core, you can move on to evaluating your matchups. And we've said some of these things, but right, like evaluating your core is looking at cards like Blizzard and saying, in some decks like Ice Lexi, you're playing all 3 of them, probably in every one, because you need a high volume of ice cards to just keep that consistency high, that you can fuse, that you can reveal when you flip over for Lexi. But in other ice decks like Oldhim or Starvo, it's not necessarily part of your core because of the deck's efficiencies. But then when you move into evaluating your matchups, which is our second big key to sideboarding, you start to look at some of those cards, and that's where different matchups demand different volumes of cards, because some matchups determine that cards are situational, and in other matchups, a card is just universally good. You don't care if you see it on any turn, but in other matchups, a card like Blizzard is only good on certain turns. When you look at the old Cheerios Briar, Blizzard was a classic card that just dunked super hard on that deck because they couldn't afford to pay for it, so it could stop turns. New Briar will have a turn where they just go play a Mount Heroic, attack you for Snatch for 7, pass, when their intention is to play a huge turn the next turn. So Blizzard becomes much more situational and not an automatic 3 of. And that's where it's important to understand that when you evaluate your matchups, it's not necessarily starting at, let's go deck by deck and evaluate every one. But there's something to be said for starting generically at what do I do into control? What do I do into aggro? What do I do into mid range? And then from there, expounding by going, okay, what is this deck, and having that as your base sideboard plan.
And as a part of knowing your matchup, it's also there are a plethora of matchups where you have one role in one matchup and then a different role in another. So it's very key when you're making your sideboard plans to figure out, am I the aggressor in this matchup? Maybe I'm playing against OTK Viserai, and I have a generally defensive deck, but I need to go pedal to the metal because he go OTK my ass if I sit there and try to dirtle around. But against other matchups, Lexi variant or the ninjas, you will play a slower, grindier game. And understanding when you need to pivot from your traditional game plan, what you want to be doing most of the time, is going to be extremely important. And understanding what decks are going to stop you from doing your thing. For instance, in our first ProCast, we were really worried about the aggro Starvo matchup into Lexi. We didn't have much testing into it, and we were thinking, the resource curve can often be pretty tight on the deck, and her Frostbites, her Disruption, her ability to pull cards from hand posed a potential challenge. And so we incorporated a lot more middle ground threats that we could play out when she was disrupting us, when she was preventing us from doing our thing, so that we were never stone cold dead to disruption. And it's important to isolate those tensions, identify them, and figure out how you can find some middle ground when your opponent is stopping you from doing what you want to be doing, whether that's blocking defensively with cards like Exude Confidence, or being stuffed by disruptive effects like ice decks have.
Yeah, I think it's important too when you're evaluating your matchups, when you do the control versus aggro concept and you use those concepts as like a base principle for how you build out your sideboard, it allows you for things that you learn along the way. One of the things that is often a benefit in tournaments, especially like ProQuest size or Road to National size versus your nationals or callings, is until you get to like the tops in like those national and calling level events, it's going to be hard to stumble across the same opponent as a buddy of yours, somebody who's played them in Swiss, and have enough time to actually give quick hints. But there are times where in a shop you have your core group of like testing partners or a group of guys where you go, hey, just so you know, this guy's playing Lexi, but he's playing Lightning Lexi. And that's not a plan that you put in, but you have an aggro plan. So you have a general idea of going, you know what? Okay, normally I have a sideboard plan built for Lexi, but Lightning Lexi probably plays more like Briar or Katsu, where I'm going to have to stop bigger attacks. I'm going to have to cover up things so I don't take additional damage. And it allows you to have like these core principles of, okay, I know this is normally not my game plan, but I can switch because I can measure it up against another deck's plan. And that's why evaluating your matchups is so important, and building it up from a core and not just going specifically this matchup I do this matchup I do that. It allows you to comparatively look at decks and say, these two decks are similar in ways that I can measure it in case I'm kind of surprised by something, or I get a sense that this person has a specific plan that I wasn't prepared for necessarily.
Right. And to Blake's point too, sideboarding is very different when you're planning for a local event as compared to a national event. You usually will know the field you're going to be playing against at a local tournament.
Yep.
Very rarely are people changing decks from week to week. Card games are expensive. Not a lot of people have the capability to do that. And while some committed players might be switching between decks, most people don't have the option between a couple.
Right.
And so you will generally have a very good sense of what you're going to be playing against. So you should build your sideboard with that in mind. In our local meta, for instance, Prism is just not very popular. So even though we know that she's sort of taking the world by storm, she's sort of a non-factor in our local meta, just because there's only a small number of people that play her. So the chances of you running into her in Swiss aren't that high. And we also have a randomly high density of her bad matchups in our meta as well. So you should really think about how, when you're building your sideboard, building about what you know people play, what you know is going to be there, and that will pay you dividends. And also understand what people are going to expect you to be doing. You can very much play on other people's expectations. And in one of our pro quests, we just randomly sleeved up Exposed to the Elements, and it paid us huge dividends that weekend because every time we played it, our opponent had to go, wow, what does that do?
Yeah.
Oh shit. Oh shit.
Yeah.
When you are playing in a local meta, people will expect certain things from you. And so when you show them a card that is kind of off the wall, you can have you can get a lot of value out of that.
Yeah.
If they're not expecting to be coming out of your deck. It doesn't have to work more than once. It only has to work one time on one weekend because these tournaments are not that long. If the cat's out of the bag by round 4, well, hey, that means you probably made that top cut.
Yep. Yeah. It also allows you the ability to, once you feel like it's becoming a little bit of conversation in the room, now people might play around it. So there's potential that you don't even have to put it in the deck. That's where you can make that quick on the spot evaluation. And that's kind of the last thing we're going to talk about is we're firm believers in the idea of sticking to 60, but you have to give it exceptions. You have to be able to undercut people's expectations and kind of throw people curveballs. And that's where like consistency is huge. And I think that's like just a sideboarding principle that sometimes people don't appreciate enough. Part of the reason we're firm believers in the idea of stick to 60 is the math is obvious. If you've got 3 of a card in your deck and you have 60 cards, the math is 1 in 20 on your first draws. Like that's just simple math. And then every card that leaves your deck after that, those 3 ofs become higher and higher. They become a higher density of your deck. The minute that you go to 63 cards, you make yourself less and less likely to see those cards at the same rate. However, when you're in a local meta or you expect a certain type of thing to come your way more often than others, that's where you're allowed to kind of break the consistency rules. And a prime example is a lot of decks playing into Oldhim when Oldhim was just pure control, all earth and ice. It was all about just decking people out with every defense reaction the deck could basically play. Sometimes you have to, chain is kind of the number one proponent for putting more cards in deck against control matchups because they can lose to themselves very much in the same way Levia loses to her own game mechanic. And it's important to keep that in mind when you're building your deck. But as a general rule, we are firm believers in the idea of sticking to 60.
Oh, absolutely. The big difference is how much better is your best card than your worst card. If the delta is huge, then you don't want to be putting in those extra cards because that'll just it'll ruin your consistency to a level that you may not expect even from just a few extra cards added. And like you said, there are definitely matchups you have to play more. If you are a chain and you're playing into any type of fatigue strategy, if you present 60 cards, the game can basically end right there. There's not a lot of agency they can have in that situation. But oftentimes you just have to understand what you need to be doing. Is me running out of deck actually a possibility? If the likelihood of that isn't really going to be there, there's no point in ever going above 60. Cards might feel like they're both good. You want both of them. It's not worth it. Just stay at 60.
Yeah.
If you're not going to be fatigued, there's no reason to go above.
Yeah. It's especially true in matchups. I think 60 being such a huge number in the math game is important in those matchups where certain cards are very key to your strategy and your win con. When you're playing into a bad matchup, there are certain cards that you just desperately need to see, but you don't need to see them on turn 1, and that becomes a pretty significant issue in a deck where sometimes turn 1 or turn 2 you draw the card. This is a prime example of that is back when Chain was running Seeds. If you ran control into it, you had to basically be married to Snag. And the issue was, as good as Snag was, if you saw it turn 1 and you just stuck in your arsenal, it was possible you just lost it to CNC, and you couldn't clear it by playing it, or you risk never seeing it again. So sticking to 60 said, okay, turn 1 or turn 2, I see it. I have to put it back in the deck because I'll see another one. But because you were at 60 cards and it was a 3 of, the consistency of seeing the card later was high enough that it was okay. Once you go to 63 or 66 or 64, you start to put yourself at risk of seeing it a turn too late. And that's when things get, nothing feels worse than going, oh yeah, I can add these extra 2 cards. It's not going to bother me. Then you lose not seeing the card that you really needed to see when you saw it, and you flip the top card of your deck, which I never recommend doing if you lose a game. Don't be like, oh man, if I saw this.
Never look.
The second you look, you're going to see the card that you didn't want to see, and then you feel bad about yourself. The only time you should feel bad about yourself is if you knew you shouldn't have gone above 60 and you went to like 63, and then you flip it and you're like, because you know what? You would have seen it. You would have seen it sooner. You would have seen it when you needed it. Punish yourself emotionally, and then you'll go back to putting your deck at 60 cards. But so those are our big 3 things for sideboarding. We believe in finding your core, evaluating your matchups, and sticking to 60. Consistency is key. If you guys have any comments or anything that you believe is like super important to your sideboard strategy that you like to adopt as like rules of thumb, put it in the comments. This is like, to me, that's one of my favorite things about these videos is reading through the comments are great, because these are the kind of videos where people can leave their hits and tips and the things that they do. I'm always interested in the way that other people sideboard, because everybody thinks differently about the game, and I love to hear what people think about it. So thank you guys for hanging out with us on this one, and we'll see you next time, where we're going to be talking about blocking and the importance of blocking, knowing your matchups there, doing the math and all those kind of things. So come back and see us on that one. Hit like and subscribe, and Nick, thanks for hanging out.
Thanks, man. See y'all later.
Peace.